It was a bitterly cold February morning when Mark Thompson, a wildlife photographer and avid outdoorsman, stepped onto the porch of his remote cabin nestled deep in the Canadian wilderness. Snow blanketed the landscape, muffling all sound except for the occasional rustle of wind through the towering pines. Mark had grown accustomed to solitude during his months-long stays in the wild, but today felt different. There was an unusual stillness in the air, as if nature itself were holding its breath. As he sipped his coffee, scanning the horizon with binoculars, something caught his eye near the edge of the forest. At first glance, it appeared to be a large shape moving awkwardly through the snowdrifts. Lowering his binoculars, Mark squinted against the bright glare of sunlight reflecting off the icy terrain. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. A massive grizzly bear, her fur frosted with snow, trudging slowly toward his cabin. But what truly stunned him was not the bear itself. It was the two tiny cubs stumbling along behind her, their movements clumsy and labored. Mark instinctively froze, his mind racing. Grizzlies were typically solitary creatures, especially during winter months when they should have been hibernating. Yet here was this mother bear, dragging herself across the unforgiving expanse with her cubs in tow. Something was terribly wrong. As she drew closer, Mark noticed the telltale signs of starvation etched into her emaciated frame. Her ribs protruded sharply beneath her matted fur, and her eyes, normally fierce and commanding, were clouded with exhaustion and desperation. The cubs fared no better. Their small bodies trembled violently in the biting cold, their cries barely audible over the howling wind. It was clear that without immediate intervention, none of them would survive much longer. Mark's instinct screamed at him to retreat inside, lock the door, and avoid engaging with such a dangerous predator. Bears were unpredictable, even under normal circumstances, and approaching a starving mother with vulnerable offspring seemed like a recipe for disaster. But then the unthinkable happened. The mother bear stopped just a few feet from the cabin steps and did something Mark had never witnessed before. She sat down heavily in the snow, lowering her head in submission. She didn't growl or bare her teeth. Instead, she let out a low, plaintive whine, her gaze fixed imploringly on Mark. It wasn't aggression, it was a plea. For several tense moments, man and beast locked eyes, each silently communicating across the chasm of species. Mark's initial fear gave way to an overwhelming sense of empathy. He couldn't explain why, but he knew deep down that turning away would haunt him forever. Slowly, deliberately, he set his mug down on the railing and took a cautious step forward. The bear flinched slightly but didn't move, her focus unwavering. Encouraged by her lack of hostility, Mark continued until he stood mere yards from the trio. "Okay," he whispered, moored himself into the bear. "Let's figure this out." His decision was bold, perhaps reckless, but undeniable. Turning back toward the cabin, Mark unlocked the heavy wooden door and swung it open wide. Then, stepping aside, he gestured for the bear to enter. For a moment, nothing happened. The mother hesitated, her ears twitching nervously as if weighing the risks of trusting a human. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she rose unsteadily to her feet and lumbered inside, her cubs shuffling closely behind her. Once they were safely indoors, Mark closed the door firmly, sealing out the brutal cold. The bears huddled together near the fireplace, their trembling gradually subsiding as warmth seeped into their frozen bodies. Mark watched in awe as the mother bear curled protectively around her cubs, her breathing steadying into slow, rhythmic breaths. Despite the danger inherent in sharing his home with a wild animal, Mark felt an inexplicable calm wash over him. This wasn't just an act of survival. It was a connection forged in the harshest of conditions, one that defied logic yet felt profoundly right. The decision to let a wild grizzly bear and her cubs into his cabin was one Mark Thompson never imagined he'd make. Yet, as the hours turned into days, he found himself navigating uncharted territory, not just in terms of coexisting with apex predators, but in understanding the delicate balance between humanity and nature. What began as an impulsive act of compassion quickly evolved into a profound lesson in trust, patience, and mutual respect. Inside the cabin, the bears settled into a corner near the fireplace, their presence both awe-inspiring and intimidating. The mother bear, whom Mark nicknamed Snowflake due to her frosted fur, remained vigilant, her golden eyes constantly scanning the room for any sign of threat. Her cubs, playful yet fragile creatures Mark affectionately called Frost and Flake, were less wary, occasionally venturing closer to investigate the unfamiliar surroundings. Despite their weakened state, they retained the boundless curiosity characteristic of young animals, sniffing at furniture legs and nudging objects with their tiny paws. Mark approached the situation with extreme caution. He knew that while Snowflake seemed docile now, she was still a wild animal capable of immense power. To minimize risk, he kept his distance, observing the bears from across the room and avoiding sudden movements. Meals became a carefully choreographed routine. Mark prepared bowls of warm broth and nutrient-rich food, placing them just within reach of the bears before retreating to a safe spot. Over time, Snowflake grew accustomed to his presence, recognizing him not as a predator but as a provider. The first few nights were fraught with tension. Mark barely slept, lie awake on the couch with a flashlight clutched in one hand and a flare gun nearby for protection. Every creak of the floorboards or soft growl from Snowflake sent his heart racing. But as the days passed, a fragile rhythm emerged. Snowflake's demeanor softened, her once guarded posture relaxing slightly as she realized Mark posed no harm. In turn, Mark allowed himself to relax incrementally, marveling at the surreal intimacy of sharing his home with creatures who belonged to the wilderness. To aid their recovery, Mark drew upon his knowledge of wildlife biology and consulted local experts via satellite phone. They advised him on proper nutrition for malnourished bears, recommending a diet rich in protein and fats to help rebuild muscle mass. With limited supplies in his cabin, Mark improvised, supplementing store-bought provisions with fresh fish caught through holes drilled in the frozen lake nearby. Each meal brought visible improvement. The cubs gained weight rapidly, their playful antics growing more energetic, while Snowflake regained some of her former strength, though her emaciated frame served as a reminder of how close they had come to death. One particularly poignant moment occurred when Frost accidentally knocked over a stack of books, sending them tumbling to the floor. Startled, the cub let out a sharp squeak and scurried back to Snowflake for comfort. Instead of reacting aggressively, Snowflake gently nuzzled her cub, offering reassurance with a low rumble that vibrated through the cabin. Watching this exchange, Mark felt a lump rise in his throat. It was a stark reminder of the universal language of maternal love, a bond that transcended species and spoke directly to the heart. As the bears recovered, Mark grappled with the ethical implications of his actions. By bringing them indoors, he had undoubtedly saved their lives, but he also risked altering their natural instincts. Bears were meant to survive in the wild, relying on innate behaviors honed over millennia. Prolonged exposure to humans could compromise their ability to fend for themselves once released. Determined to avoid creating dependency, Mark devised a plan to gradually reintroduce the bears to their natural environment while ensuring they remained healthy enough to thrive. He began by constructing a makeshift outdoor enclosure adjacent to the cabin. Using sturdy logs and wire mesh, he created a secure space where the bears could acclimate to colder temperatures without being fully exposed to the elements. Inside the enclosure, he placed tree branches, rocks, and other natural features to simulate their native habitat. Slowly, he introduced live prey, small rodents and fish, to encourage hunting skills, especially in the cubs. Snowflake participated eagerly, demonstrating techniques passed down through generations of grizzlies. These lessons reinforced Mark's belief that nature, when given a chance, could heal itself. Despite his efforts, saying goodbye loomed large on the horizon. As spring approached, the bears grew stronger and more independent. Frost and Flake bounded around the enclosure with newfound confidence, while Snowflake stood tall, her commanding presence restored. Though Mark cherished every moment spent with them, he understood that their true home was the untamed wilderness beyond his cabin walls. Keeping them dependent on human care for too long would do more harm than good. On the morning of their release, Mark opened the gate to the enclosure, stepping back to give the bears space. Snowflake hesitated at first, her powerful body poised between the safety of the familiar and the call of freedom. Then, with a final glance at Mark, she led her cubs toward the forest's edge. Mark watched in silence as they disappeared into the trees, their forms blending seamlessly with the snowy landscape. Though his heart ached with loss, he felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. He had done what needed to be done, not for himself, but for them. The departure of Snowflake and her cubs marked the end of an extraordinary chapter in Mark Thompson's life, but also ignited a deeper commitment to bridging the gap between humans and wildlife. What had started as a desperate act of kindness toward 3 struggling bears evolved into a lifelong mission to protect and preserve the fragile ecosystems they call home. Through their journey together, Mark came to understand that his role wasn't merely about saving individual animals. It was about fostering a culture of coexistence, where humans and nature could thrive side by side. In the weeks following the bears' release, Mark dedicated himself to documenting their story. He sifted through photographs, videos, and journal entries, piecing together a narrative that captured not only their miraculous recovery, but also the broader challenges faced by wildlife in increasingly hostile environments. The result was a book titled Frozen Bonds, A Winter's Tale of Survival, which chronicled his unlikely alliance with Snowflake and her cubs. The book resonated deeply with readers worldwide, becoming both a bestseller and a rallying cry for conservation efforts. Its success allowed Mark to establish the Wilderness Guardians Initiative, a nonprofit organization focused on rehabilitating injured or orphaned animals and preserving their natural habitats. Under the initiative's umbrella, Mark launched several groundbreaking programs aimed at addressing the root causes of wildlife endangerment. One of his first projects involved collaborating with local governments, indigenous communities, and environmental scientists to create protected zones where human activity, such as logging, mining, and recreational hunting, was strictly regulated. These efforts ensured that animals like Snowflake and her cubs could roam freely without constant threats to their survival. Additionally, Mark worked tirelessly to educate the public about responsible outdoor practices, hosting workshops and school programs that emphasize respect for wildlife and sustainable living. Mark's advocacy extended beyond policy changes and scientific advancements. It touched lives on a deeply personal level. People who had followed Snowflake's story online reached out to share how it had inspired them to take action in their own communities. Some volunteered at animal sanctuaries, while others organized cleanup drives or fundraisers for endangered species. Even children wrote letters to Mark, expressing admiration for his bravery and asking how they could help protect the planet. To these young advocates, Mark responded with encouragement and advice, reminding them that even small acts of kindness could make a big difference. One particularly moving moment occurred during a visit to a nearby elementary school. As Mark recounted Snowflake's tale to a rapt audience of wide-eyed students, a little boy raised his hand hesitantly. "Mr. Thompson," he asked, "do you think Snowflake remembers you?" Mark smiled, pausing to consider the question. "I'd like to believe she does," he replied. "But whether she remembers me or not isn't what matters most. What matters is that we help give her and her cubs a second chance, a chance to live free and wild, just as they were meant to." His words sparked a wave of enthusiasm among the children, many of whom pledged to become wildlife heroes in their own right. Inspired by their energy, Mark introduced a new program called Young Protectors of the Wild, designed to empower youth to take an active role in conservation efforts. Participants learned skills such as tracking animal behavior, identifying native plants, and building sustainable habitats. By nurturing this next generation of stewards, Mark hoped to ensure that the lessons of Snowflake's story would endure long after he was gone. Back at his cabin, Mark continued to honor the bond he had formed with the bears. He converted part of his property into a sanctuary for rescued wildlife, providing temporary shelter and care for animals in need. Though none of them stayed permanently, the goal remained reintroduction to the wild. They all left an indelible mark on his heart. Each creature reminded him of the resilience and beauty inherent in nature, reinforcing his belief that every life deserved protection. On quiet evenings, Mark often found himself gazing out at the forest, imagining Snowflake and her cubs thriving somewhere deep within its embrace. Occasionally, he ventured into the woods, searching for signs of their presence. Tracks in the mud, claw marks on tree trunks, or distant roars echoing through the night. While he never encountered them again, he took comfort in knowing they were out there, living the lives they were born to lead. Years later, when Mark finally decided to retire from active fieldwork, he passed the reins of the Wilderness Guardians Initiative to a new generation of leaders. Among them was Dr. Rachel Bennett, a passionate conservation biologist whose dedication mirrored his own. Together, They ensured that the organization would continue to grow and adapt, meeting the ever-changing needs of the environment. Though Mark stepped back from the spotlight, his legacy lived on, not only through programs he had built, but also through the countless lives he had touched. Today, visitors to the Canadian wilderness can still see traces of Mark's impact. Plaques along hiking trails bear quotes from his book, urging travelers to tread lightly and leave no trace. Schools incorporate his teachings into their curricula, fostering a culture of empathy and responsibility. And in the hearts of those who knew his story or who simply felt its ripple effects, Mark Thompson remains a symbol of hope, proof that one person's compassion can spark a movement capable of changing the world.